June 6, 1944. For the Allied forces, it was the beginning of liberation. For the German soldiers waiting on the coast of Normandy, it was the moment they had feared for years. The invasion had finally come. For months, rumors had spread through German ranks. Somewhere along the endless coastline of occupied France, millions of enemy soldiers were preparing to strike. The question was not if the Allies would come. The question was, where would they land? And when the first ships appeared on the horizon, thousands of German soldiers realized something terrifying. The largest amphibious invasion in history had begun. This is the story of D-Day. Not from the beaches of America, Britain, or Canada, but from the bunkers, trenches, and battlefields of the German defenders who stood waiting for the storm. Chapter 1. The Men Waiting for the Invasion. By 1944, the German military had controlled much of Europe for several years. But the situation was changing. On the Eastern Front, Germany was fighting a brutal war against the Soviet Union. In Italy, Allied armies were pushing north. And in the West, Germany knew another attack was coming. The western coastline of Europe had become a massive defensive project. It was called the Atlantic Wall. A chain of bunkers, artillery positions, mines, obstacles, and defensive structures stretching thousands of miles from Norway to France. German propaganda presented it as an unbreakable fortress. But behind the concrete walls were ordinary men. Many were not elite soldiers. Some were young recruits. Some were older men. Some were wounded veterans transferred from other fronts. Some had been sent there because they were considered unfit for the brutal fighting in the East. They were the men who would face the first wave. One of those soldiers was Private Heinrich Severloh. Stationed near Omaha Beach, he was a young German machine gunner. Like many defenders, he did not know exactly when the invasion would happen. Every day looked the same. Watching, waiting, listening. The ocean was calm. The villages were quiet. But everyone knew something was coming. Chapter 2. The Night Before the Storm. June 5, 1944. Across Normandy, German troops prepared for another ordinary night. But the weather was terrible. Strong winds, heavy clouds, rough seas. Many German commanders believed an invasion was unlikely in such conditions. Even Allied commanders had questioned the weather. But hidden across the English Channel, thousands of ships were already moving. The invasion force was coming. And Germany was about to experience the largest military surprise in modern history. The German defense was complicated by disagreements among its commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed the invasion had to be stopped immediately on the beaches. His argument was simple. If the Allies were allowed to establish a foothold, Germany would never push them back into the sea. Rommel wanted tanks and troops positioned close to the coast. He believed the first 24 hours would decide everything. But another German commander, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, believed the armored forces should remain further inland. The debate created uncertainty. Where should Germany fight the decisive battle? On the beaches? Or inland? The answer would soon arrive. Just after midnight, the darkness above Normandy began to change. German soldiers heard something they had never heard before. The sound of thousands of aircraft. The invasion had started. Above them, Allied airborne troops were dropping behind German lines. Their mission: capture bridges, destroy communication lines, create confusion. For many German defenders, the first sign of invasion did not come from the ocean. It came from the sky. Reports flooded German command centers. Paratroopers everywhere. Enemy aircraft everywhere. Explosions in multiple locations. At first, some German commanders believed the airborne landings were a distraction, a fake attack, a trick, because Germany was still expecting the main invasion somewhere else. But soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Allies were coming, and they were coming now. Chapter 4. The Armada on the Horizon. At dawn, German lookouts stared across the water, and what they saw changed history. A fleet so large it seemed endless. Thousands of ships, landing craft, warships, aircraft filling the sky. For the German defenders, it was a terrifying sight. This was not a raid. This was an entire army arriving. Many German soldiers had fought before. They had experienced artillery. They had seen tanks. They had survived battles. But nothing prepared them for the scale of D-Day. The Allied war machine was enormous. And now it was directly in front of them. Chapter 5. The First Shots on the Beaches. At 6:30 in the morning, the first Allied landing waves reached Normandy. 5 beaches. 5 different battlefields. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, For the German defenders, the moment they had waited for had arrived. Orders were given. Weapons loaded. Machine guns aimed. The Atlantic Wall opened fire. At Omaha Beach, the German defenses were especially deadly. The terrain favored the defenders. High cliffs overlooked the beach. Machine guns could fire down on exposed troops. Artillery positions were hidden. German soldiers knew that if they held their positions, they could inflict enormous casualties. But they also knew something else. The enemy in front of them was overwhelming. Chapter 6. The Battle Inside the Bunkers. Inside the concrete bunkers, German soldiers experienced a nightmare. The ground shook constantly. Allied naval guns fired thousands of shells. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the sound of explosions. Many German defenders were trapped underground. Some believed they were about to be buried alive. Others waited for the Allied infantry to reach them. For the men behind the guns, there was no grand strategy. No political speeches. No understanding of the entire war. There was only survival. Load. Fire. Repeat. But slowly the impossible happened. The Allied soldiers began moving forward. The beaches that were supposed to become killing zones became the beginning of a breakthrough. The Atlantic Wall was holding. But not forever. Chapter 7. The beaches begin to break. Chapter 7. The beaches begin to break. By late morning on June 6, 1944, the German defenders of Normandy faced a reality they had hoped would never happen. The Allies were not being pushed back. They were not retreating. They were coming inland. The Atlantic Wall, the defensive system Germany had spent years building, was beginning to crack. For the German soldiers inside their positions, this was the moment of realization. The enemy had survived the first wave, and now they were bringing more. More men, more tanks, more weapons, more supplies. The invasion was no longer a landing. It was an invasion force with a foothold in Europe. German commanders now faced a desperate problem. The original plan had been simple. Destroy the invasion on the beaches. But the beaches were not lost everywhere. At some locations, German defenses had caused heavy casualties, especially at Omaha Beach. But even the strongest resistance could not stop the endless flow of Allied troops. The question changed. It was no longer, can Germany stop the invasion? It became, can Germany contain it? Chapter 8. The Battle of Omaha, from the German side. Among all the Normandy beaches, Omaha became one of the most famous. From the German perspective, it was also one of the most successful defensive actions of the day. German positions were built into the cliffs. Machine guns covered the beach. Artillery could strike approaching landing craft. The defenders had a deadly advantage. Private Heinrich Severloh was positioned above Omaha Beach. Armed with a machine gun, he watched as American soldiers came toward the shore. Thousands of men, moving through water, carrying heavy equipment. Many were exposed. For German defenders, it was a moment of brutal military reality. The attackers were vulnerable. The defenders had the advantage. But the German soldiers also faced something terrifying. They were surrounded by the power of the Allied military. American battleships fired from offshore. Aircraft attacked German positions. The coastline shook under constant bombardment. The defenders could fight, but they could not win a battle against unlimited resources. Chapter 9. Rommel and the Lost Chance. One of Germany's most respected commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, understood the danger better than many others. He had personally inspected the Atlantic Wall. He saw weaknesses. He knew the Allies would have enormous naval and air support. Rommel believed the invasion had to be destroyed immediately, before the Allies could move inland, before they could bring their full strength. But on June 6th, Rommel was not in Normandy. He was in Germany visiting his family. He believed the weather made an invasion unlikely. By the time the invasion began, critical decisions had already been made. The German response was slower than it needed to be. The German command system created another problem. Hitler personally controlled the release of important reserve forces, including powerful armored divisions. 4 hours, German commanders waited for permission. Every hour mattered, because every hour allowed the Allies to bring more troops onto French soil. Chapter 10. The German tanks move. The German army still had powerful weapons. Among them were the famous panzer divisions. German tanks had earned a reputation across Europe. But in Normandy they faced a different kind of war. The Allies controlled the skies. German movement became dangerous during daylight. Any large movement could attract Allied aircraft. German tank crews were not just fighting enemy soldiers. They were fighting the entire Allied system. Air power, artillery, supply lines, industrial production. The battle was becoming a war of resources, and Germany was running out. Chapter 11. The villages of Normandy become battlefields. For German soldiers, Normandy was not just a military battlefield. It was someone's home. Small French villages became combat zones. Fields became tank battlefields. Roads became dangerous supply routes. Civilians were caught between two armies. Many German soldiers had spent years occupying France. Now they were fighting on land they had controlled. But the situation had completely reversed. They were no longer the advancing army. They were defending. Chapter 12. The psychological battle. One of the biggest challenges for German soldiers was not just physical. It was psychological. For years, German propaganda had presented the Allies as unable to defeat Germany. But now, reality was standing directly in front of them. The enemy had crossed the sea. The enemy had landed. The enemy was moving forward. Many German soldiers were young. Some were teenagers. Some had only recently arrived in Normandy. They had trained for war. But training could not prepare them for the scale of D-Day. Chapter 13. The fight for every road. After the beaches, the battle entered a new phase. The famous Normandy countryside became a nightmare. The landscape was filled with hedgerows. Small fields separated by thick walls of vegetation. Perfect places for ambushes. Every road, every field, every village could hide the enemy. German soldiers used the terrain to slow the Allied advance. They fought from hidden positions. They launched small counterattacks. They tried to make every mile expensive. For the German defenders, the goal was no longer victory. It was time. Every day they delayed the Allies was another day Germany could prepare. But the Allies had something Germany could not match. A constant flow of soldiers and equipment. Chapter 14. The collapse begins. By July 1944, the situation became increasingly desperate. German forces suffered heavy losses. Supplies became limited. Allied air superiority made movement difficult. The invasion force continued growing. The German soldiers who had stood behind the Atlantic Wall were now fighting a completely different battle. A battle of survival. They were no longer protecting a fortress. They were trying to avoid destruction. Chapter 15. The last stand in Normandy. In August 1944, the German army faced disaster. The Allies broke out of Normandy. The German forces attempted to escape, but many were trapped. The battle became a catastrophe. Thousands of German soldiers were captured. Thousands more were killed or wounded. The men who had waited behind the Atlantic Wall had witnessed one of history's greatest military operations. They had seen the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. They had fought against overwhelming power. And they had watched the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. Chapter 16. The silence after the storm. The morning of June 7, 1944 arrived differently for the German defenders. The first day of the invasion was over. But the battle was only beginning. Across Normandy, German soldiers looked at the coastline they had been ordered to defend. The beaches were no longer empty. They were filled with enemy troops, vehicles, weapons, and supplies. The impossible had happened. The Allies had created a bridgehead in Western Europe. For many German soldiers, the feeling was not anger. It was realization. The invasion they had spent months preparing for had arrived, and they had failed to stop it. Chapter 17. The War of Waiting and Delay. After D-Day, German commanders understood that Normandy could no longer be defended the same way. They needed reinforcements. They needed supplies. They needed time. But time was exactly what they did not have. The Allies were building a massive supply network. Ships continued arriving. Airfields were established. Thousands of vehicles moved inland. Every day the Allied army became stronger. The German army became weaker. This was the difference between the two sides. Germany had experienced soldiers, strong defensive positions, powerful weapons. But the Allies had something even more powerful: production. America's factories produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ammunition on a scale Germany could not match. The battlefield was becoming a war of industry. Chapter 18. The German soldiers' reality. Behind every military decision were ordinary soldiers. Men carrying rifles. Men sleeping in fields. Men writing letters home. Many German soldiers had no idea what the future would bring. Some still believed reinforcements would arrive. Some believed a counterattack would push the Allies back into the sea. Others quietly understood the truth. The war was changing. For many German troops, the biggest enemy was exhaustion. They fought during the day, moved during the night, lived under constant air attacks, and watched their numbers slowly disappear. Chapter 19. The Fight Against the Air. One of the greatest fears of German troops in Normandy was the Allied Air Force. The sky belonged to the Allies. During the day, German movement became dangerous. A single vehicle on an open road could attract an air attack. A group of soldiers moving across a field could become a target. German soldiers called Allied fighter bombers J-bows. The aircraft appeared suddenly, attacking roads, railways, tanks, supply lines. For German troops, the battlefield was not only in front of them, it was also above them. Chapter 20. The Battle of the Hedgerows. The Normandy countryside created one of the most difficult battles of the war. The fields were surrounded by thick hedgerows. To an outsider, they looked peaceful. Green fields, small villages, quiet farms. But inside those fields was a brutal battlefield. German troops used the landscape perfectly. They placed machine guns behind hedges. They created ambush points. They forced Allied soldiers to fight for every small piece of land. The Allies had numbers. The Germans had defensive skill. The result was a slow and bloody advance. Chapter 21. The Arrival of the Tiger Tanks. Among the most feared weapons in the German army was the Tiger tank. Its armor was thick. Its gun was powerful. Many Allied tank crews feared facing it. But even the Tiger had weaknesses. It was expensive, difficult to maintain, and vulnerable without support. A powerful weapon could not change the fact that Germany was fighting a war against overwhelming numbers. Chapter 22. The Battle for Caen. One of the most important battles after D-Day was fought around the city of Caen. The Allies wanted the city because it was a key transportation center. The Germans knew its importance. They defended it fiercely. For weeks, German forces fought to prevent the Allies from breaking through. The battle became a symbol of the entire Normandy campaign. Neither side wanted to give up. But the fighting came at a terrible cost. The city was heavily damaged. Thousands of soldiers became casualties. And the German army continued losing strength. Chapter 23. Rommel's Final Days. For Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Normandy became the final major campaign of his military career. He had warned German leaders about the danger. He knew the situation was becoming impossible. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's car was attacked by Allied aircraft. He survived but suffered serious injuries. He would never return to command. Later, Rommel became connected to the internal crisis inside Nazi Germany. His relationship with the regime had become complicated. In October 1944, he was forced to take his own life. One of Germany's most famous commanders was gone. Chapter 24. The Final Breakthrough. In late July 1944, the Allies launched a massive offensive. Operation Cobra. Its goal? Break out of Normandy. After weeks of fighting, the German defenses finally collapsed. The front line that Germany had tried so desperately to hold began moving backward. For German soldiers, this was the moment they had feared. The enemy was no longer trapped on the beaches. The enemy was moving across France. Chapter 25. The Fleeing Army. The German army that had once marched across Europe was now retreating. Soldiers abandoned damaged vehicles. Units became separated. Communication broke down. The organized defense of Normandy was disappearing. Some soldiers surrendered. Others continued fighting. Many simply tried to survive. The war that had begun with confidence and conquest was ending with desperation. Chapter 26. The Legacy of the German Defenders. Today, Normandy is remembered as a place where history changed. Visitors walk across the beaches. They see the bunkers. They visit the cemeteries. They remember the enormous sacrifice. The German perspective of D-Day is not a story of victory. It is a story of collapse. A story of soldiers caught inside a war that was already turning against them. A story of a defensive wall that could not stop an unstoppable force. D-Day was not only a military operation. It was the beginning of the end of the Second World War in Europe. And for the German soldiers who stood on those beaches, it was the moment they realized the war had finally reached their doorstep. Chapter 27. The Collapse of the German Defense. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the German army was no longer the force that had once conquered much of Europe. The soldiers who had defended the Atlantic Wall were now scattered across the countryside. Some units were destroyed. Some were captured. Others continued retreating toward Germany. For many German soldiers, the biggest shock was not only losing the battle. It was seeing how quickly everything changed. Only weeks earlier, they had been preparing to defend France. Now they were fighting to escape France. Chapter 28. The German soldiers who became prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would eventually become prisoners of war during the Allied advance. For many, surrender brought a strange mixture of emotions: relief, fear, uncertainty. Some German soldiers had spent years fighting. They had seen battles across Europe. They had lost friends. They had lived through constant danger. Now suddenly the war was over for them. Many prisoners wondered what would happen next. Would they return home? Would Germany survive? Would their families still be alive? The answers were unknown. Chapter 29. The French civilians between two armies. While soldiers fought, civilians experienced a different kind of battle. For 4 years, France had lived under German occupation. The arrival of the Allies brought hope, but it also brought destruction. Normandy's villages became battlefields. Homes were damaged. Roads were destroyed. Families hid in shelters as bombs fell. For many French people, D-Day represented freedom. But freedom came at a terrible cost. Thousands of civilians were killed during the fighting. Chapter 30. The Myth of the Invincible Atlantic Wall. Before D-Day, German propaganda presented the Atlantic Wall as an unbeatable fortress. A barrier that would stop any invasion. A symbol of German strength. But the reality was more complicated. The wall was not one continuous fortress. It was a collection of defensive positions. Some were strong. Some were incomplete. Some were poorly equipped. Concrete could stop bullets. Bunkers could protect soldiers. But no wall could defeat an enemy with overwhelming control of the sea and sky. Chapter 31. What German soldiers thought of the Allies. One thing many German soldiers remembered after the war was the scale of the Allied invasion. The number of ships. The number of aircraft. The amount of equipment. German soldiers were fighting an opponent that seemed to have unlimited resources. Every destroyed Allied vehicle was replaced. Every fallen soldier was replaced. Every lost weapon was replaced. This created a feeling among many German troops. They were not only fighting soldiers. They were fighting an entire industrial machine. Chapter 32. The Role of Propaganda. During the war, propaganda shaped how people understood the conflict. The German government tried to convince its population that victory was still possible. Even after D-Day, some Germans hoped for a miracle. A new weapon. A major counterattack. A political change. Anything that could reverse the situation. But on the battlefield, soldiers saw a different reality. They saw damaged equipment, retreating forces, and an enemy growing stronger every day. Chapter 33. The Last Days of the Normandy Battle. By August 1944, the German position in Normandy became impossible to hold. The Allies had broken through. Paris would soon be liberated. The German army was moving east. The battle that began on the beaches had transformed into a massive Allied advance. D-Day was no longer just a landing. It had become the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. Chapter 34. Remembering the German Defenders. Decades later, the German soldiers who fought in Normandy are remembered in a different way. Not as heroes of conquest. Not as symbols of Nazi Germany. But as individuals who experienced one of history's greatest battles. Many were young men placed into a war created by a regime that caused destruction across Europe. Their personal stories reveal the human side of conflict. The fear. The confusion. The suffering. Chapter 35. The Lesson of D-Day. D-Day remains one of the most studied military operations in history. It shows the courage of Allied soldiers who crossed the beaches. It shows the determination of German defenders who fought from their positions. And it shows the devastating reality of war. From the German perspective, D-Day was not a single moment. It was the beginning of a collapse that had been approaching for years. A moment when the balance of power shifted forever. Today, the beaches of Normandy are peaceful. The sounds of artillery have disappeared. The bunkers remain silent. The fields have returned to normal life. But beneath the quiet landscape is the memory of one of humanity's most important days. June 6, 1944. The day the largest invasion force in history crossed the sea. The day thousands of soldiers stepped into uncertainty. The day Germany's western defenses faced their greatest test. And the day the future of Europe changed forever. If you want more cinematic history documentaries, hit subscribe and join us.